What's up, mi gente? I'm Andres Incapié, and you are listening to Mixtape, your favorite Afro-Latin podcast.
You really don't start hearing the germs of what mambo would become, what was known as son montuno at the time, what would become known as mambo, and then much later salsa, until 1942, 1943. It's those recordings where we begin to see the development of his son montuno style. Musicians who I interviewed, as well as dancers, there was two words, the way they described Arsenio's son montuno style. One was contratiempo, and the other was negro, and also macho.
First of all, a bit late, but still valid. Happy New Year 2026 to all of you. I really hope this year brings better things for us all. We really needed them, although it's not looking like it's gonna be better than last year so far, but I hope it is. Cross fingers. Today's single presents an interview with Professor David García. Professor García is an ethnomusicologist who has studied Black music and Latin music of the United States, with a theoretical focus on race and racism, and who holds the Robin March Haynes Distinguished Professorship in the Music Department at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. He's the author of the book Arsenio Rodríguez and the Transnational Flows of Latin Popular Music. Our interview with Professor García is part of the investigative work for track 27 of Were You Listening, where we dive deep into the song Bruca Maniguá, one of the most famous songs by the great Arsenio Rodríguez. Check it out. Today's single title is inspired by the song Para Bailar el Montuno by Arsenio Rodríguez.
And first, I'll tell that I'm very excited to hear about this because I was looking for when I started working on the episode. I was like, where do I find literature about Bruca Maniguá? And then I bumped into your book in the library, like the music librarian was like, you should look at this section. And then I bumped into your book, and that's why I was like, oh wow, of course I had already met you, but I didn't know that you had a book on Arsenio Rodríguez. Like, this is perfect. So to begin with, why don't you tell us a bit about your story, your career as an academic, and probably your music career as well. I think you also do some music.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Andres, for inviting me to be a part of your podcast. I've known about it for probably since close when you started it in 2020, as you mentioned. And I'm really happy to revisit my work on Arsenio, which was initially, he was the topic of my dissertation, which I completed in 2003 at the City University of New York. I graduated with a PhD in the ethnomusicology program. But I started graduate school in 1995 when I did my master's at UC Santa Barbara in ethnomusicology. And one of my first teachers, and really my first mentor, is Robin Moore, who teaches now at the University of Texas. And he's published a lot on Cuban music mostly. And at first, being from an Ecuadorian family, both of my parents are from Ecuador. There's musicians on both sides. I learned how to play guitar when I was self-taught when I was in my teens. And Latin music was always around the house, including salsa. But I didn't know Arsenio Rodríguez, who he was and why he was important, until I met Robin Moore, because I was planning on doing graduate research in Andean music. That's what I was kind of like interested in initially. But Robin kind of got me into thinking about Cuban music. I took one of his graduate seminars. Being also from Los Angeles, I was considering doing some kind of research, whether for a seminar paper or what have you, on the Latino culture, history, music, whatever, in LA. And it was Robin who told me about Arsenio Rodríguez. He told me a couple of things. He said first that Arsenio Rodríguez was a very important person in Cuban popular music history. However, not much has been written, certainly not in English and not really in Spanish in terms of research, academic research. And then he also said, and also, by the way, he died in Los Angeles in 1970. So everything kind of came together in a way, but I really didn't decide to commit to researching on Arsenio until I first listened to one of his recordings. It was a compilation published by Rounder Records. I'm forgetting the exact title right now, but it was a compilation of Son Montuno. It had some Celia Cruz on it. It had some Sonora Matancera, early septetos and sextetos, kind of like a history of, and then a lot of Arsenio recordings with his conjunto, his Cuban conjunto in the 1940s. And then out of the blue, there's one track that much later in researching, I learned that it was a track from 1967 that he recorded in New York, though he was living in Los Angeles at the time, called Para Bailar el Montuno. If you haven't heard it, and for your listeners, track it down. You can find it on YouTube. You could probably you should be able to find it on Spotify and all that. And it just blew my mind because first of all, the groove, the Son Montuno groove, Arsenio's music, it's there, and it's just feels really, really great. But it's his Cuban tres. He's got it connected through, it's amplified, and he has a distortion on it purposefully. And it kind of sounds like, this is like rock, Latin rock. And it's just, I just, and being a guitarist, I was like, oh, I got to do this. There's too much happening here. I'm completely in. So that's how I started.
So, well, you answered then it's sort of my second question, which is what was your motivation to write the book about Arsenio Rodríguez? So then let's jump into the third one then. So what is the main message of the book, and do you think that message is still relevant today in the context of Latin popular music?
Yeah, I think there were a few things that I wanted to accomplish with the book. The first was, although it was published with an academic press, I really wanted it to be readable and legible beyond academia, naturally, because Arsenio still has a lot of fans, like diehard, and I'm thinking specifically of students of Latin music, many of whom I interviewed in the process of researching Arsenio Rodríguez, and many of whom since passed. I'm thinking, for example, of Andy Gonzalez, bassist, and also a very serious student of Latin music history, Cuban music in particular. So I wanted to write something that they would approve of, basically, because I respected their knowledge so much, not to mention their musicianship. I also wanted to honor Arsenio's importance. I think, again, those who knew Arsenio, those who know Arsenio, and he's known among especially older generations, loved and respected by musicians and music lovers across the board, and not only in Cuba, but really all over the world. So I wanted to honor his memory and then also his contributions to the music, and we'll get into the details in a bit about his role in what we understand salsa to be today. But even before that, mambo. And then thirdly and lastly, I discovered this as I was researching, especially as we'll talk about Bruca Maniguá and the lyrics, and through other sources of information. Arsenio was very clearly proud of being a Black Cuban. He knew his family's history going back to Africa, namely from, as he would say, the Congo. And so we see this in his lyrics. I know this through many interviews that I conducted about Arsenio, who he was, how did he think. He was as much proud of being Cuban as he was being a Black man. And being the case from the late 1930s all the way through his career, there are many songs like Bruca Maniguá where he very clearly expresses his pride of being Black and Cuban, and then also writing about what many Black populations over many generations have faced in terms of racism, discrimination, oppression. And he wrote about that stuff. So, there was no way of going around those topics. It was really the core of who Arsenio was.
Mírame, ingenuo como un niño otra vez. Tú sonríes y me hablas y yo me pongo a tus pies. Yo no sé, es que es místico, mágico es.
And it's interesting because, of course, I had heard many songs by written by Arsenio without knowing. I feel like this is the experience of a lot of people. Like, you've heard his songs and his music, because sometimes it hasn't even changed that much when they make the arrangement, and you don't even know that you're listening to Arsenio's music. Bruca Maniguá, an example. I totally thought that Bruca Maniguá was a song by Ibrahim Ferrer, and then once I started researching, I was like, wait, this is Arsenio Rodríguez work. How is that? So in the context of, you mentioned his how proud he was of being both Cuban and a Black man, and I feel like I was more familiar with the music that came in the early 80s, maybe in the 90s from Cuba. That was in my impression a lot more. I'm proud of being Cuban, and then Cuba is, we're all Cuba, and so it was nice to see him. And through the eyes of through the writings of your book, that he was able to have both of those two identities really in his music.
Yeah, and it wasn't that it was unheard of at the time, but it was very unusual, especially before the 1960s. And so in Latin popular music, we could find some really important examples of music that in one way or another gives us insight into the life and working conditions, say, for example. But Arsenio it was all very upfront. There was nothing hidden, except maybe in his use of language, which again is very much happening in Bruca Maniguá, I would say strategically.
Well, I'll ask you about the strategic usage in a second. So let's get into the what role, and you mentioned already mambo, so might as well ask you both. What role did Arsenio Rodríguez play in the development of what we know as salsa music and mambo?
Yeah, I think I would start by saying that he really standardized basically what the modern instrumentation of especially salsa music would become. Prior to his conjunto, the popular style of playing Cuban son music was by septetos, so two trumpets, tres, rhythm guitar, singers, bongo, bass, and so on. And then it wasn't necessarily that Arsenio was the first. Of course, he's credited, though, popularly as being the first to bring in the piano into the septeto format, making it a conjunto, the first to bring in the congas, making it a conjunto, the first in adding a second and a third trumpet. However, he's the one that, in doing it, he was really the most artistically and commercially successful at the time, at least at a local level in Cuba, in Havana in particular. In his earliest recordings, his conjunto started recording with RCA Victor in 1940. But you really don't start hearing the germs of what mambo would become, what was known as son montuno at the time, what would become known as mambo, and then much later salsa, until 1942, 1943. It's those recordings where we begin to see the development of his son montuno style. Musicians who I interviewed, as well as dancers, there was two words, the way they described Arsenio's son montuno style. One was contratiempo, and the other was negro. And also macho. So first, the contratiempo was much more sort of a musical term for musical purposes. And that's just what basically means it's syncopated. It's a groove that layers different patterns and all following different syncopated rhythms, but are working together in clave. Of course, from the dancer's perspective and the musician's perspective, it generated a unique kind of feel that really grabbed, and again, I'm basing this on interviews, It was something new, that it was the next step, the development of son in its history. And it was something that was special about Arsenio's style, the son montuno style. The macho referred primarily to the sound, the power that his conjunto, that people said that his conjunto had. They played all percussively, and that also then lent itself to the danceability of his music. Percussively, not only the conga players, obviously, or the bongo player, but the trumpets, the pianists, they were all playing percussively. And this is something that I use to teach when I've directed our Charanga Carolina at UNC, is to think about playing your instrument percussively, whether you're playing violin or flute or what have you. So that's what really macho kind of, I think what people were kind of getting at in characterizing his son montuno style as macho. And then there was negro, which then there's this pride element again, because he was primarily playing for Black social clubs. In developing this new style, it was with not only merely for, but it was with Black dancers, Black Cuban dancers in Havana, that really the style emerged. Specifically for mambo, along with other groups like Arcaño y sus Maravillas, the charanga, who were also playing gigs with Arsenio for Black social clubs. There was this sort of popularity of a particular rhythm that would become or crystallize as the mambo rhythm. Bum, 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 bum. There were many variations of that. It wasn't just that one. But that really kind of became the sort of the marker of this new movement that then kind of became popular throughout around the local music industry and was picked up by big bands, including by Perez Prado. And then, so entered the commercial music industry, including the US dominated recording publishing industry, who had a strong foothold in Havana, also in Mexico City, also in Buenos Aires and different parts of Latin America, in making this music internationally popular. And it was the sound of the big band that was sort of the most legible, I would say, internationally, and is like maybe the main reason why it was Perez Prado who became associated with the mambo, and not really, or not enough, Arsenio or Arcaño. So yeah, that's a little bit of background of sort of like his importance musically in the history of mambo and salsa.
And is there a song that comes to mind as the song or a couple of songs that are pioneers with this dun 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 dun, dun rhythm?
One of the earliest examples of where we hear these rhythms coming in Arsenio's recordings is one of them is A Buscar Camarón from 1943, Ye from 1945, Esa China Tiene Coimbre from 48, it's a little bit later. So there are these, there are many others. But I think the important thing is the dating of it around 1943, 1942-43, where we hear the germs of this music that would later become known as mambo. There's another one is Mi Chinita Me Botó from 1944. That one, No Hay Haya Sin Guayacán. That's a really good one from 1945. And they're just such great recordings. They're just classics. A lot of these songs were covered and have been covered by salsa bands, which is yet another way of appreciating Arsenio's contributions to salsa, having been covered since like the 60s, the earliest part of salsa's history, all the way through, re-recording songs from the early 40s. I mean, says a lot about what he had established and popularized in the 40s that would then become popular again in the 1970s.
Mi gente, before we continue, I wanted to take just a few seconds to remind you that in the Mixtape podcast, we aim to center the contribution of Black people and culture across Latin America, the Caribbean, and their diasporas through dance and music. If you're enjoying this episode, be sure to check out our Were You Listening track 27, in which we dive deep into the song Bruca Maniguá with the help of Professor David García and Melseme, a singer and performer in the Buena Vista musical on Broadway. Give it a listen, you won't regret it. Also, remember to follow us on Instagram at mixtape.podcast and click the link tree in our bio to find all of our episodes across all platforms, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Right, back to our interview.
Yes, his music is definitely lasting. So in your book, and to the point, in your book you talk about the song Bruca Maniguá, which now is part of this musical about Buena Vista that's running in Broadway. And the song, of course, you tell is written by Arsenio Rodríguez. Can you tell us a bit about the story of this song? What did it represent at the time Arsenio wrote it? And what did it represent as part of Arsenio's career?
I'll start by saying that Bruca Maniguá was the first Arsenio song to be recorded by RCA Victor in particular. And it was recorded not by Arsenio's group. It was his pre-conjunto group. It was a septeto in the late 1930s. It was recorded by Orquesta Casino de la Playa, sung by Miguelito Valdés. Orquesta Casino de la Playa was an all-white big band, it's kind of like a jazz big band, a Cuban jazz big band. It shouldn't be a surprise for your audiences to know that in the 1930s and 40s, not only in Cuba but elsewhere, much of cultural life was segregated along racial as well as class lines. And so there were black social clubs, there were white social clubs, there were social clubs based on labor unions. Then, of course, the academias de baile, most were segregated. So Orquesta Casino de la Playa, like most Cuban big bands, was an all-white group that played for primarily, if not entirely, all-white Cuban and then also tourist audiences. But they were all friends. Arsenio knew Miguelito Valdés because they played they frequented similar, in spite of segregation, it wasn't all segregated, right? So they knew each other because they were musicians. And Arsenio invited Miguelito Valdés to record the song that he wrote as Bruca Maniguá in 1937, which they did. So that's sort of the background of the song. The music itself, it's complex because it's steeped in Cuban popular music, Cuban popular culture, history, and race, going back to the 19th century in the form of, for example, zarzuelas, which is, for your audiences, zarzuelas were sort of light operas. It has a long history throughout Latin America, including Spain. So, and it was in Cuba in the 1930s, and in the decades leading up to the 1930s, many of the sort of stories, and this was sort of staged, kind of like light opera, as I mentioned already, dramatizations of stories, a lot of which took place in colonial era Cuba. And like blackface minstrelsy in the United States in the 19th century, there were character types, like the negrito, in similar kinds or genres of stage entertainment that included music. There were certain kinds of music that were used to signify a particular character type. And it was the tango congo that was used to signify a character who was either a slave or a freed black person in this otherwise very colonialized image of Cuba and Cuban history. Much of this, once the recording industry kind of emerges in the early 1900s, becomes used in popular music as recorded in songs like Bruca Maniguá. There comes sort of like the strategicness of Arsenio. He's basically using a style of music that was very much around still, this tango congo, Afro-Cubano, going back to the 19th century, that was, among other things, stereotyped to black characters. But then utilizing that very popular format to flip the script and to talk about black oppression, and to do it by not merely by using exaggerated Africanized Spanish, which was used as part of the stereotyping of black characters. And then there again, he used that very common trope of stereotyping Black Cubans by inserting actual words in Congo to express his critique of race relations and the history of racial relations in Cuba from the perspective of the voice, sort of like a doubled voice of, on the one hand, this very common normative racialized voice that is the Black Cuban, el negrito, but then also the Congo who's speaking to that history in this very same voice. It was Miguelito Valdez who really kind of, gave voice literally to the messages that Arsenio was writing about in Bruca Maniguá. So again, coming back to the commercial music industry, the recording industry in particular, there were all kinds of different words that were used, even for Bruca Maniguá, because Bruca Maniguá, once it became a hit, it was re-recorded by a lot of different bands. So there was no consistency it was sometimes called Afro Son, Afro Cubano, Tango Congo, Canto Congo, so on and so forth. So that's all, it's all sort of like, but the Tango Congo also has a very specific meaning, which is reference to the rhythm.
But do they all refer to the same rhythm, the tan 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 tan?
Essentially, yes. Yeah, it became that became the staple of this genre of music that was being popularized on recording, especially at this time.
Was that, for whatever reason, I have a memory of that, which I didn't know what it was, but that sound in like Mexican cinema from the golden era.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there's yet another way of understanding, like, all of this was interconnected with the international popularization of Afro-Cuban or Cuban music, in this case, in the space of Mexican films of the late 40s and 50s. But I'll say one more I wanted to say one more thing about the Tango Congo, this rhythm. And here again, we have this element of doubleness. That again, Arsenio Rodríguez, I believe Arsenio Rodríguez, even Miguelito Valdez and other musicians knew what they were doing. They understood this. And so there's, in Bata, there are toques for Ogun that sound very much like the Tango Congo that's used. It's sort of like a if you think of as played by the three batas as a composite, if you bring everything together, you hear that rhythm there too. So it's very important for us to understand all these elements of songs like Bruca Maniguá as constituting a doubleness. There's two things going on at the same time.
Yeah, it's like it has so many layers I guess that's part of I think that's part of the genius of somebody like Arsenio, putting all of those, I guess that's the strategic thing that you were mentioning, putting all those layers in a way that somehow didn't disturb.
Exactly. Didn't disturb. I mean, that's exactly, I mean, did it disturb sort of those who weren't in the know of the doubleness, that just took it for granted, and then also those who got it, both of which got pleasure out of this music, right?
It's a bit, for me, it's kind of surprising because you write about the orchestra, or you just told us about Orquesta Casino de la Playa and how they were all white Cuban musicians, but also and I'll just read a little strip from your book that says Afro-Cuban oral traditions and speech were unintelligible to most listeners of Cuban popular music, especially the audiences of Casino de la Playa, which consisted of tourists and white Cuban elite in Havana. So how did they how did they manage to, or how were they interested in this thing? It sounds almost like if you think from like US rejecting of this culture, how were they able to, because they were not singing in blackface, were they?
No, they weren't.
Yeah, so it's not like a minstrel show. Like they're actually just singing this song that I wrote, and I'm wondering how the dynamic work.
In terms of sort of its international popularity, whether in English dominant speaking countries like the US or in Spanish speaking dominant countries like in various parts of Latin America, outside of Cuba, this wasn't really legible, even for perhaps most Spanish speakers. And I certainly didn't know what was being said. And what I did, to come back to my dissertation research, I interviewed Felipe García Villamil, who was a practitioner of Santeria and also very much a practitioner of Palo. So steeped in this culture, because otherwise there was no way I was going to be able to begin to make sense of what this all means. And it was Felipe García Villamil who I interviewed in 1998. I mean, literally sitting down in his living room in the Bronx, playing the recording and pressing pause after each line, and him explaining to me, not only translating, but explaining. I mean, that's it. That was the knowledge that was shared with me. That was the entry point into all of this, without which there was no way I could write about what I ended up writing, right? And so I would say that, using myself as an example, it's the same for listeners, record buyers, or live in vivo at the cabaret, that they just wouldn't know. And then there's the element of exoticization as well. They didn't really care. It sounded exotic. It sounded, different. It sounded black, maybe to like Cubans, for sure, black, but they weren't there necessarily to. I'm kind of like speculating a lot here, but I would be surprised if anybody was really interested in, like, what are you saying? Perhaps that happened, and maybe Miguelito Valdez might have explained it. Who knows? But what he said about it, I would imagine, be situational. So yeah, as you were mentioning before, it's complicated, it's complex, the history of it, like its legibility, all many different kinds of possibilities. I'll end with, I have to give credit to interviewees like Felipe García Villamil, who were gracious enough to share their knowledge with me.
Get into the last question. So Buena Vista Social Club, the musical group who sings, I want to say, the most popular version of Bruca Maniguá, or the most recent popular rendition of Bruca Maniguá with Efraín Ferrer. They take their name from social clubs, in particular the Buena Vista Social Club, that I didn't even know existed until I started researching about this. And you already mentioned a little bit about social clubs, but could you expand a little bit on what were the social clubs in general and the Buena Vista one in particular?
Yeah, Buena Vista was located in Marianao, which is sort of in the outskirts of Havana. It was one of the handful of Black social clubs that Arsenio thrived in and performed regularly. The social clubs, including the Black social clubs, they were, what would you say, like community groups. They served the community, especially in terms of organizing events to celebrate patriotic days. Some of them offered sort of sporting events for their members. By the way, and the social club could only exist by applying for permission to function as an organization. So they weren't really informal. They were formal entities recognized by the city, right, by the government in Havana.
Does that mean that they could be subject to censorship as well?
Yes, I did read, when I was in Havana researching the social clubs, I did read their applications for recognition, right? And in it, they had to state that they were not a political organization and that their organization exists not for political purposes, and political speech will not be permitted in any of their events. Of course, where do you draw the line, right? So, be that as it may, they provided sort of educational support for the families, broadly conceived, not only for children. So they were very important parts of communities, neighborhoods across the city. And so Buena Vista Social Club was one of these, and it was a Black social club, as I said, in Marianao. And in addition, they organized dances in the evenings. And so Arsenio, and they had what I would imagine courtyards, or they would play inside their sort of, their locations, the places where they were located. And that's where Arsenio played, and he actually wrote at least one song about Buena Vista, which was a wawanko, but stylized by his conjunto in 1957. I think it's called Buena Vista Se Votó. It's a great track. It's one of my favorites. And he does mention, he calls out, he shouts out some members' names.
Okay, so we've talked about your dissertation from years ago, but what are you working on these days?
I'm working on a big project called on the long 19th century history of Latinos in the United States. It started off focusing on Latin music in the United States before recording technology, but it's expanded out because, it's not unsurprisingly, we have a long history in this country, all the way back to its founding, and there's a lot being done. I'm certainly not the only one researching on there. There's a really thriving field of 19th century Latino studies, which consists of amazing scholars doing really, really important work about Latinos in the United States. But I'm also thinking of like John Leguizamo, what he's doing sort of way beyond academia about talking about the history of Latinos in the United States. So I've been working on this for the past almost 10 years now.
So have you gotten some books out of that?
No, I mean, eventually I'll write a manuscript. I presented a lot in conferences. I have a couple of articles out, but really, and this connects to your podcast, I'm pre-production in developing a podcast myself.
Oh, do you have a name already?
I'm still working. It's tentatively called the U.S. The history of Latinos in the United States. I mean, it's very, very basic. It's not really eye-catching, but we'll get there eventually at some point. I had border crossings for a while, but it turns out there are a handful of other podcasts with those two words.
Yeah. Yeah, and when do you have a date in mind already?
No, not really. It was this coming January, but that's not going to happen. You appreciate
Yes,
it. Sure.
that.
I'm planning on 10 episodes for the first season, and whether or not there's a second season, we'll see. I just started doing interviewing for one of the episodes, and I'm not in a hurry. I guess I'm at a stage in my career where I'm fortunate enough to kind of like take my time. And I really appreciate that. I'm not taking advantage of it, but I really want to take my time because it's huge. It's a huge topic that's complex, and I'm also kind of going beyond just music, as I mentioned. I love it. I feel it's very important, and once it comes out, I'll be happy for it to be out.
Absolutely. We'll be on the lookout for it for sure.
I'll let you know for sure. Maybe you could cross promote it on your podcast.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll send it also to so I was born in Colombia, but I have cousins that were born here. And I feel like they would benefit a lot. So I look forward to listen it to myself and as well as pass it through to some of my family members and the audience for sure.
Great. Thank you.
All right, so thank you so much, David. This was awesome.
You're welcome.
And that's it.
All right. Well, thank you, Andres, for inviting me to be on your podcast.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I wish I had done it earlier.
No worries.
Thank you so much, David.
All right. Take care.
before I say goodbye, I want to thank Professor David García again for spending some time with us, for sending me a physical copy of his book, Arsenio Rodríguez and the Transnational Flows of Latin Popular Music, and for sending me a copy of his doctoral dissertation with the translated lyrics of Bruca Maniguá, which were extremely useful, all of these resources for the Were You Listening episode 27. We look forward to your academic work and to your podcast coming out this very year. And I'm also thankful to my training in Afro-Cuban dances with Maestra Marisol Blanco. It was thanks to that training that I was able to recognize the kobu kobu, the ogun, which I added in the episode earlier, after Professor Garcia mentioned the toques de ogun in bata drums as the basis of the tango congo. And to our audience, thank you so much for listening. This is Mixtape. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at mixtape.podcast and click the link in our bio where you can find all of our episodes across all platforms including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. If you have any suggestions, ideas for collaborations, or reflections about any of our episodes, email us at themixtapepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. This is Mixtape.